faith and psychology to help all of us navigate through the common struggles that life brings to us. I'm Father Nicholas Lowe, priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in the city of Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm joined by my co-host and my wife, Dr. Roxanne Lowe, a clinical psychologist. And we want to thank all of you for taking time to join us this evening. You know, before we get started with this evening's conversation, which we're so excited about, we want to encourage you to stay connected to us all throughout the week. And you can do so by connecting to us at any of our social media accounts, which can all be found under the headings of The Lows. And that last name is kind of an awkward spelling. It's spelled Louhs. So it's The Lows. And we also want to invite you to share with you that we have begun sending out daily inspirational messages that will be sent out to your email every day. So if you're interested for some daily inspiration all throughout the week, you can subscribe to these inspirational messages by going to our website at www.thelows.com. At the very top of the banner, it simply says subscribe. Just click on that link. It'll kind of walk you all the way through that. So once again, we also want to encourage you to join the conversation tonight by calling in at 1-855-237-2346. You know the number by now, but it's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question during the show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And if you're listening to us on our social media accounts, whether it be through Ancient Faith or even at the Lowe's social media accounts, you can type a question into the message area there, and we'll definitely try to get to it. So tonight we're so excited to have Dr. Jeanne Constantino, my professor, by the way, at the seminary, and an extraordinary woman of faith, who is out with a brand new book that I want to encourage all of you from the very beginning to consider it. It's a great Christmas gift. It's a great book. It's Thinking Orthodox: Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Mind. And if you've been part of the Healthy Minds, Healthy Souls family, you know this is just right down our alley, and it's just been released by Ancient Faith Publishing. So most of you already know her on Ancient Faith, but let me just kind of gloat a little bit about how amazing Dr. Constantino is to me and to all of us. Dr. Jeanne Constantino holds several degrees in theology, including a Master's of Theology degree from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, Harvard Divinity School, and she has a PhD from the Université Laval, where she wrote her doctoral dissertation, now listen to this, on the Apocalypse in the Ancient Church. Very, very interesting. She also has a Juris Doctorate from Pepperdine University School of Law and a member of the California Bar. She has taught theology at biblical studies at the graduate level, including at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Theology, which I was very privileged and blessed to have her as my teacher, and the Patriarchal Athenagoras Orthodox Institute. She maintains trust me when I tell you this, a very busy teaching schedule. She teaches biblical studies and early Christianity to undergraduates at the University of San Diego and advanced scripture classes to graduate students at the Franciscan School of Theology and at St. Athanasius and Cyril Coptic School of Theology. She's been a regular speaker at retreats and conferences for over 40 years. And she has a long-running podcast right here on Ancient Faith called Search the Scriptures, and has just a tremendous amount of following. Search the Scriptures, just so that you all know, because if you're part of the Healthy Minds family and Healthy Souls family, you definitely need to be part of the Search the Scriptures family as well. It airs Monday nights, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. And once again, Dr. Constantino is here with us to talk about her brand new book, Thinking Orthodox. Dr. Constantino, it is a pleasure to have you on our show again.
Thank you for having me, Father and Roxanne. It's so great to be back. The last time I was on your program, which wasn't too long ago, we were talking about your extraordinary book. And I remember that we really had a good time together. The time just flew by.
It did. And it was so, and once again, thank you for endorsing our book. We were so blessed to have your name and just all the expertise that go with that. But
we always enjoy our time with you, Dr. Jeannie. It's just a wealth of wisdom. And we are so, I cannot tell you, I mean, in even just the table of contents, you absorb so much wisdom. It in of itself is a course.
Yes.
Okay, yes, that was
I know
very.
What you mean. I was going to say, I wasn't so sure about how much to include in the book, where to draw the line, what to really, and how much it should encompass. So sometimes I thought it should be 2 books, but to me, things seemed to tie together.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
it ends up as one book, you know.
I love
you.
that level of detail. I mean, people could turn, I mean, there's just so much. I'm so excited, like about every section. But tell our audience just a little bit, for people who don't have this book yet,
Yes.
what is Thinking Orthodox all about?
Thank you for asking. Yes, most people don't have it because it was released literally 1 week ago today. So the title is Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring the Orthodox Christian Mind. And it's based on the fact that it's a response to the fact that we have a need to remember what it is to think as Orthodox Christians, what makes us Orthodox is not just our beliefs that are different from Catholics and Protestants, but why we have those beliefs. That is the foundations of our theology and the difference that makes in terms of our day-to-day life and the way we live in our relationship to Christ. So that's the thinking part is called frenema, and that's a word that has a lot of deep meaning. It means mind, but it also means worldview. It's an attitude. It's a stance. It's a way of life. And that's all summed up in one of those Greek words that has a lot of meaning. It's summed up in the word frenema. And if you come to Orthodoxy from another religious tradition, then very often you don't have an Orthodox frenema. It has to be something that's acquired by living the faith day to day, very carefully, very mindfully, very thoughtfully. But you can be raised in the church and not have an Orthodox frenema either, because you could be more influenced by the values of the world or influenced by Western Christian thought. So it influences everything about Orthodoxy. And I wrote the book because too many people are lacking it, and we see extremes, either complete disregard for church teachings and traditions, or an extreme obsessive compulsive kind of nature with these church traditions, and extreme in sort of a focus on externals, and thinking that if you're more extreme, then you're more Orthodox. If your beard is longer, if you fast more, if you do these things, this is the true Orthodoxy severity. And that is not what Orthodoxy is at all. As a matter of fact, it's freedom and it's flexibility and things that people don't ordinarily consider as something Orthodox, but it really is.
Well, you actually warn quite a bit about the legalism. You talk about that in the book and warn people about their own legalistic views toward our doctrine.
Yes. Well, we have to be very strict on certain areas of doctrine, right? Some things have no compromise.
Right.
Dogma, there's no compromise ever on dogma. But in areas of practice, and Father knows this from experience as a pastor, there has to be a great deal of flexibility. This is not one size fits all. When we talk about the canons of the church, we don't apply them the way the Catholic Church does as laws. Everybody has to follow this rule. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility in Orthodoxy, but it's done with discernment, and the flexibility is not applied by us ourselves. I'm going to decide what I want to do. It's applied by the spiritual Father, who recognizes where we are in our life and creates a kind of environment and the rules and the guidance for us. But everyone is different.
And I think just for our listeners, if you're just tuning in, we're talking to Dr. Jeanne Constantino, who's talking about her brand new book that we just want to encourage all of you to get. It's called Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Mind. Wow, I think it's so appropriate, especially in what we're kind of going through right now in the society that we're living in, where we oftentimes just kind of just deal with things. We like things so quick. We just kind of go to the website, we get quick information, and we tend to kind of allow ourselves to just look for the quick fixes. And I love that word frenema. And I love it because I think, as you beautifully stated earlier, President, is how so often in the English, you miss so much of the nuances and really the deeper meanings of the original word that was written in Greek, the word frenema, which we see throughout. St. Paul uses it quite a few times. But in the English language, we just simply translate it as mind or a mindset.
Right.
But I'm reminded of what Romans, in the book of Romans, chapter 12, verses 2, where it says,
I was just going to mention that. Yes, go ahead, Father.
No. You're the teacher, so you are.
you mention it because my verse. One of the verses that uses that word comes right after that verse, which was sort of the catalyst for your book.
Right.
Your book is not, do not be conformed to the world, this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So you're absolutely, now there the word is nous, which has it, and I even talk about the nous in this book, but that's the whole point. We are not supposed to conform our minds to the world, but conform them to Christ and the church. And the question is, how do we do that? Because all day long we are bombarded with messages like, you're not thin enough, you're not beautiful enough, you're not rich enough, you don't drive the right car, or, you're going to fail. What really matters is achieving some kind of measure of success that the society puts upon us. And of course, there's nothing wrong with striving to reach goals, but it's one thing to do that with the right mentality, the right attitude. It's another to do that because you are conforming to the mind of the world. So that whole idea is very much a part of what frenema is. So after the verse that was, the inspiration behind your book, Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. In Romans 3, there's a verse that uses a lot of, it is the word frenema 3 times. Okay. By the grace given to me, I bid everyone, actually, this is really not the best translation because I'm reading from the RSV here, but I'm going to take my translation from my book because I tried to translate it in a way that was a bit more literal. And it uses the word frenema a bit more, I would say, correctly. So the idea is that you are supposed to change your mind and transform it to conform to be the mind of Christ. And now that I'm looking for it, I cannot find it, but I will. We could continue with our.
I think that's so important because I think when we talk, about this mindset, when we know that our thoughts shape our life and they shape our behaviors, and I think we should not underestimate the power of our mind and how you beautifully stated earlier, Dr. Constantino, about the importance of just having that discernment, because our mind is one of those things that left unchecked can take us off the ranch and can lead us in a way it can lead us astray. And I think we hear that a lot through the church fathers about how the devil yearns to kind of use our minds in ways to undermine us. And so I think it's so beautiful that this book is about really yearning to acquire an Orthodox mindset and how important that is in our walk of faith.
So much. And so there's a couple of places in Romans where we have the word frenema, and also it's used a lot in Philippians. So here's that passage that I was looking for with my own version. For I say, through the grace given to me, this is Romans 12, to all who are among you, that each one not be high-minded, hyper-phronein, concerning himself, more than he ought to think phronein, but to think phronein in the right-minded manner, sophophronein, according to the measure of faith as God has apportioned to each. But there's a very famous passage that also uses the verb and the noun, because it's both a verb and a noun. For Romans 8:5-7, for those who are according to the flesh have their minds on phronousin, there it's a verb, the things of the flesh, but those who are according to the Spirit on the things of the Spirit. For the mindset phronema of the flesh is death, but the mindset phronema of the Spirit is life and peace. For the mindset phronema of the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit itself to God's law, for it cannot. So there you see that we can have, everybody has a phronema. The question is, what kind of frenema do you have?
Right.
Do you have one of the world of the flesh, or are you actively trying to orient yourself toward God and to the frenema of Christ and the church?
And can you talk a little bit about, Dr. Jeannie, how this sort of Orthodox mindset could apply practically in our own walk of faith?
Yes, I think that first, what do we realize about this, and how do we apply it? Well, first of all, we have to try to acquire it. So we can't apply what we don't have, right? So how do we acquire that? In terms of, for Orthodox Christians, what we try to do is acquire the mindset of the early church. What is that? That is to think as the church thinks, to think as the early Christians thought, to do as they did. So I want to take us back in our minds and imagine being in the early church. Imagine you are you're the first believers in a place like Thessalonica or Philippi or Corinth, and you have met St. Paul, and he's come and he's taught you the gospel, and you have received it joyfully. You've been baptized, and you meet Paul every day. You still have your life to live. They did too, just like we do. You have your sandals to make, or your tents, or your pottery, or whatever it was, your fields to plow, but you would meet with St. Paul every day, and he would instruct you in the faith. But he just didn't teach you facts, and he didn't hand you a pamphlet or a Bible and say, here, read this. He taught us, and all the apostles taught us how to live. They acquired this attitude toward life, a way of life that they received from the Lord. So when we talk about tradition in the church, this is not human tradition. This is the tradition of the Lord, which they imbibed for 3 years. They drank from deeply. Think of the hours the apostles spent watching the Lord, listening to him, absorbing his frenema, his attitude toward people, his way of life. And that's what they taught when they went out to preach the gospel. That is what they brought, not just the message, but a whole way of life. The church has continued that over the centuries. And that's what we are trying to enter into, because to have the mind of the church is to have the mind of Christ. So we do this by coming to church, by praying the prayers, by being involved in the sacramental life of the church, by reading the lives of the saints, by orienting ourselves constantly in that way, by giving alms, all the things, all the little things, making the 5 loaves service, making the boiled wheat for the loved ones who have passed on. All those little things that sometimes people think, well, I don't have time for that, or that's not important. These things, all of them in countless ways, shape our mind in the same way that advertisements affect us. We don't think about it. Sometimes it's just in the background, but you're grown-ups. You can remember, commercials from when you were children, or favorite lines from TV shows when you were little. Why do we remember these things? They've impacted us, and they're part of who we are. So because we spend so much time in the world, we have to really actively seek to create an Orthodox frenema in our minds, to reorient ourselves.
I imagine that level of actively seeking and intentionality is what you mean when you discuss in the book the notion of that effort is required for growth in frenema, right? That it does
Like
require
everything.
our active participation.
Absolutely.
And I mean,
So,
how does this apply even in something like spiritual warfare? I mean, this is, I know you talk about that a lot in the book, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on how that effort shapes us in dealing with something like spiritual warfare.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that we have to be engaged. So, for example, let's say an average, I hate to say this, let's say an average Greek Orthodox Christian. And I'm putting myself in that category, especially when I was younger. And I really, was committed to the church. I was very involved in the church, Goyan, youth director, and all those things before I met my husband, Sunday school, everything. But I didn't know what it was to be Orthodox. I really didn't. It was a particular priest who came to the parish who started talking to me about the Jesus prayer. I never heard of the Jesus prayer. Can you believe that? Growing up in the church, I never heard of the fathers. I mean, I heard of St. Basil's Chrysostom, Basil with the Vasilopita, St. John Chrysostom with the liturgy. I didn't know who the fathers were. I was never exposed to this. And we have a lot of people who are kind of coming to church and they feel like they're involved, but they're really not actively engaged in the spiritual life. So, Roxanne, you're absolutely right about talking about spiritual warfare. And that's what Paul is talking about with Romans. isn't he? By not being conformed to this world, but being recognizing our inclination toward pursuing our self-will and saying to ourselves, I'm not going to do that. No. And
Well, go ahead, please.
no, go ahead.
No, I just was wondering, I mean, as you were speaking about your own experience in the church, I think we hear that very, very commonly.
I mean, I
and
could relate to that too.
Most of us,
Right.
Nick and I are both cradle Orthodox, and I could relate to exactly what you are sharing. Much of what we've learned is in our adulthood. It was not in our, and
Yes.
I never missed a Sunday growing up. I mean, it was
Right.
everything you said, Sunday school, everything. But how can someone raised in the church lack this Orthodox frenema? And what do you think is behind that? And what could we be doing differently as a faith? Because this is an incredible wisdom that we don't want to wait until we're, in our mid 50s to acquire. And it would be, I think, so
Right, right.
important to begin teaching
Sure.
this from a young age.
Well, let's start by saying, I think that if you come to church on a regular basis and you are paying attention to the services, you have some Orthodox frenema. I think it's kind of impossible to be the way we were. So I did have an Orthodox frenema. I didn't know a lot about the church. So I wasn't really into it the way I became later when I began to recognize, wow, when we start to tell our people about these incredible stories about the lives of the saints, about the meaning of the things that we do, about our history, it is really impressive. And people walk away really stunned and surprised at the depth, the depth of orthodoxy. It's deeper than anything, the rational mind can conceive. See, we spend most of our times in our rational mind, right? But when we go to church, if we at least follow along, we will have something of an Orthodox frenema. I know that I did, and I want you to tell me, for the two of you also being raised in the church, if you did. And here's where I know that I did, because I was in college and I was in a class. I was taking a scripture class, Matthew and Mark. And the teacher, the professor, who was Catholic, by the way, and this was a Catholic university, said that Jesus came to be baptized by John, right? Therefore, he had sins. Now, this is not Catholic doctrine, okay? Would be heresy for Catholics too. But I was totally shocked by that. And everybody else took notes and they wrote it down. And I said, I'm not writing that down. That's not right. Even though it sounds rational on the surface, and I never took a theology class, right? I mean, I came from a very typical Greek American house, and we never discussed theology or anything like that, okay? So how did I know that that's wrong? And how is it? I'll give you another example that's from the book. I was in a class as a master's student with a bunch of other Christians, mostly Catholics, and our professor said, well, what if the bones of Jesus were discovered and you could prove that they really were the bones of Jesus? Would that make any difference to you? And every single person in the class, and there were almost 30 of them, said, it wouldn't make any difference to me. I would still, be a Christian. And I'm like, I thought they had lost their minds. And I began to wonder if I had lost my mind, because it matters. I said, are you kidding? The resurrection is everything. Without it, we have nothing. So I was the youngest person in the class at about 30 years old. These are all older, very involved in their churches and things like this. And so I thought, is everybody this kind of clueless? So it happened to be Holy Week, and we have, because you're there in Florida, we have Greek or Easter picnics here for Easter, for Pascha. And I went to the picnic. And I started asking people if the resurrection makes any difference, because I wanted to, how do I know that it matters that much? And they don't seem to get it. So I asked, first I asked my mother, who was 70 years old, does it make any difference that Jesus rose? And she says, yes. And I said, why? And so she struggled to find the words to articulate it, but she did. Okay. And then I asked my niece, who was 18 years old, who also struggled to figure out how to say it. But they both came up with the same thing. He opened heaven to us. Okay? He made the relationship with God possible again for us. That's what he did. Okay? Neither of them said he paid the penalty for our sins, right? So they had already an Orthodox frenema.
Orthodox frenema without knowing that they had it.
they had it to some extent. They just didn't have the language to articulate it easily. That's what I got out of studying theology. I got the language to express what I already experienced intuitively. So I don't think it's necessarily always lacking, but we could do much better because we don't recognize the incursion of the world into our minds. So I turn on the computer to search something, but I used to have like a Yahoo homepage or something. I stopped doing that because you go on to just search for something and you're distracted by all these things, the different celebrities, what they're doing, this dress, the computer knows where you've been, shoes, there's like shoes that pop up in the side or
incredible.
a dress or something, a purse, and it's so distracting. And frankly, this is one of the biggest ills of our age, the distraction. And that's what the devil is really expert at, distracting us, taking our minds away from God. We can tell this because as soon as we start to pray, all these other thoughts, I can't forget, I have to, So this is now, and we're becoming less focused and more distracted all the time because like Roxanne mentioned, you want to look something up and instantly you have an answer. And this creates a lot of problems. So the problems that I see for the cradle-born Orthodox is not slipping into the rationalism of the West. And this is a real danger where everything has to be explained logically and not recognizing that God is mystery and there are things that we simply cannot logically explain. So some of us, we're still absorbing that from the culture because it surrounds us. We're not living in an Orthodox country.
I love that. We're talking to Dr. Jeanne Constantino. Her brand new book is just coming out, Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Mind. You can find it right here at Ancient Faith Publishing. We also want to invite you to call in. If you have a question for Dr. Jeanne, you can call in right now at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. Or you can simply just put it in the comment line on social media under the Ancient Faith Radio tab if you're on Facebook, or under the Lowe's Facebook tab. You can simply just ask us a question and we'll try to get to it before the end of the show. Dr. Jeanne, I was just thinking as you were speaking, I think that one of the beautiful things that, and maybe you felt the same way growing up as I did, and that is that, there was always something that I felt was missing. So that when in your case, you had that priest who kind of inspired you and encouraged you and maybe shared with you, and in my case, I actually had as I've shared before, I had a Protestant Baptist preacher that kind of asked me, why am I Orthodox? And I just said that, well, we just are. We're the true church, and but I think the struggles I think that I think would be so one of the areas I think that we as a church really could do better, and I think your book touches on this a lot, is recognizing the need to be hungry. Recognizing that we aren't, that nothing else will sustain us. The Bible says, apart from Him, you will have no peace. And I think, and I love that Orthodox frenema, that it's not something that you get; it's something that you're constantly working to have, and acquiring, and. Also recognizing that what you feel may be filling you, if it's not, steeped into the church fathers, the church, and the sacramental life of our church, then in many ways you're just getting a quick fast food meal that's going to sustain you for a little bit, but then ultimately doesn't.
Right.
Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think people are finding Orthodoxy. Most people don't even know it exists still, unfortunately. But you're touching on a real sense of a need, a spiritual hunger in our culture. So most people, when they think about the options there are for Christianity, when they're considering maybe some kind of a faith, if they believe in God or they decided they believe in God, they think Catholic or Protestant. They don't even imagine that there is such a thing as Orthodoxy. And both of those really fail to satisfy the deep hunger inside. And of course, I know and have many Catholic students and friends and colleagues, and they love their church and they're devoted to their church. But there's definitely something missing there that Orthodoxy supplies on the deepest, most profound level, and also within Protestantism, because both of you mentioned it. First of all, especially with the Protestant faith, for Protestant frenema is highly influenced by emotionalism. And this idea of a feeling like, praise, and everything has to be hyper and praise and feel good. And that's how you feel close to Christ. There's no or little, of course, it's very hard to rationalize or I mean generalize about Protestants because there's so many different kinds, but they are really yearning for this relationship in Christ, but they don't know how to achieve it, or they think they already have it because they're saved or born again, and there's something really missing. There's that idea of engagement with Christ on a very deep level, and they want to be with Christ. I sincerely believe that. But there's nothing to sustain that or to deepen this relationship in their tradition. They all have traditions, even though they say they don't believe in tradition. They all have their own traditions. And then in the Catholic Church, also with the Protestant Church, everything is focused on the rational mind. So in the Catholic Church, and I've documented all this is in the book, I mean, it's always dangerous when you draw broad generalities about people. I don't want to be misrepresenting it because obviously there's a piety in Protestantism and there's a piety in the Catholic Church. But basically the Catholic theology and Protestant theology are founded on the application of reason. And this is where we depart from them. And they are willing to say things and arrive at conclusions that we would never arrive at because what we say is only what the early church said. So when the emphasis is so much on the application of the rational mind, then you come to think that everything must be explained rationally. And that really is the frenema of Western Christianity. And ultimately, that fails. Why does it fail? Because then God is not greater than our rational mind, what we can conceive. They recognize that he is, right? They know that. And yet, everything about God almost everything has to be explainable about salvation, about God, about the sacraments. So there's definitions and explanations for everything. And Orthodoxy shrinks back from that. We try very hard not to explain things, right? So it's a very different frenema. Go ahead.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that's a generalized sort of universal human struggle, is the temptation to want certainty and explanation and guarantee. I think it almost sort of goes against, the human struggle to sort of say, it is a mystery and you have to develop a comfortability around it being a mystery and you not having, necessarily it all explained. And that does play on, as you just so beautifully said, the application of reason. We really have to challenge our mind to develop that tolerance and acceptance for that struggle.
That's right.
But I think that's what life is about, right? You're in a constant struggle your whole life of trying to sort of...
Exactly. But what they are retreating into this fallacy of certainty. So how do you have it as a Protestant? Generally speaking, of course, it is, I'm saved, right? I've accepted Lord Jesus Christ and I'm saved. So I don't have to worry about it anymore. Absolutely. Because he said so. And this is where it is in the scriptures. And they point to these verses taken entirely out of context. And they say, I don't have anything to worry about. But that doesn't, there's something we can see. There's missing from their lives. There's a lack of a deep spirituality. But on the Catholic side also, they do believe that they have a level of certainty. How will you go to heaven or not? Well, they can answer that question. The answer is yes, if you die in a state of grace. And they have defined what that means. So they know, or they believe that they know exactly where they stand with God. But the fact is, none of us knows. And from the Orthodox, and the Orthodox tradition says, you don't know. You're supposed to, because look, I don't know about you. Well, you said you grew up in the church. I'm sure you were committed to the church. I was too. And at a certain point, I said, now I'm really committed, because when I met,
Right.
I learned what orthodoxy is. And I was 20 years old or so. And I'm really committed to orthodoxy. But then 5 years later, say, I thought I was committed. I'm not really committed. Now I'm really committed. And we realize that we never arrive. We never arrive at the level of commitment to God that we ought to have. And, Roxanne, you mentioned about how we live the life. How do we appropriate it? We have to constantly be examining ourselves. Why is it that I don't, just prior to this program, I was hearing the father in the podcast talking about the Apostles' Fast. It's a little bit out of, it's not appropriate to our time, but he was talking about committing even to something like the Apostles' Fast, which is one of those fasts that sometimes we kind of let go or ignore. Okay, that's one of those little minor fasts. So I thought, I get it. He's right. Because I've said, well, it's the Apostles' Fast,
Right.
I do it too. We all do. So it's checking ourselves, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that notion.
Yes.
To constantly examine. And really,
right.
Do you run into this where you see a lot, of people, Orthodox faithfuls who believe, well, if I'm fasting, I'm doing my sign of my cross, I'm following the sacraments.
Yeah.
This must be the guarantee. Almost sort of the danger of relying on this sort of rigidity around these tools, rather than seeing them as tools.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to add too. If we're not careful, that same certainty kind of comes with. On the flip side is that for those that are doing the externals, as opposed to what we used to say at the school, we're so focused on the externals and not worrying about the internals. But that certainty of, if I just do that I have to do this much fasting and this much, there's no really transformational frenema. And I think that's what it has, what we're talking about.
It's incredible
Absolutely.
to think about. I mean, the differences in frenema affect really how Christians relate to each other, or whether they even understand each other.
I think it totally affects how we understand each other. One reason why I wrote the book is because I don't believe that we understand each other. The Protestants think they know who we are, and they don't. Catholics think they understand. They just think we're sort of a form of Catholicism without the Pope, because we use a lot of the same language, but we don't mean at all the same thing by it. So when we talk about salvation, what does it mean to be saved? Protestant means one thing, the other. And the Catholics have the beatific vision. When I try to talk about theosis, they tell me it's the same thing, but I know it's not the same thing. Okay, but they don't have the frenema that we have. They don't approach it in the same way. And the same thing for the Protestants. It was going to heaven. How often do Orthodox talk about going to heaven? We don't really use that phrase because we don't think of it as a destination. So it's a very, very different approach that we have that other Christians don't, share with us. And of course, when we're talking about doing these things in the Catholic Church, you have a concept of merit. Like you can earn merits. They also have indulgences still, in the Catholic Church, where you can earn indulgences, which is time out of purgatory, which another concept we don't have, by doing certain things. Well, we don't believe that you could earn anything. Right. Even our fasting, our prostrations, I think you brought up something very excellent there, Roxanne, but people and Father thinking that somehow by doing these things, this is not only what it means to be Orthodox, but this somehow makes me righteous in the eyes of God. But really, that's an idol. That's not appropriate. We don't earn our salvation in any manner. And if we don't have the right attitude as we do those things, then they don't benefit us at all. As you mentioned, Father, it's a tool. It's not an end to itself. But many Orthodox Christians think, well, this is what I have to do. And they don't really engage in this with the proper attitude. So they fast, but they're fasting, let's say, from meat, but not with their eyes. They might watch something on television or a movie that's very suggestive, very racy. This is not I don't care how much you're avoiding meat. If you're watching something inappropriate, who cares that you're fasting? Excuse me for saying this, but we knew somebody very close to us who was living with a girlfriend. They weren't married. And and one of the arguments was that he was fasting during Lent. And I said, for Lord have mercy. Who cares that you're fasting during Lent when you're living with this girl and you're not married?
But notice the rationalization of the mind.
There you go.
What you were mentioning earlier about the wrong fronema, the wrong mindset that we kind of justify. This,
missing the big picture.
And if you're not anchored to the church in Christ, you, again, even with that, we can use that word fronema, but it can allow us to really go off of, and not, it has to be anchored to the Christ, the church, and the traditions of our church.
And what I try to get across in the book, this was what was very challenging for me, is trying to create in the book an idea of the balance in orthodoxy. You are all about balance, the two of you, the balance in the soul and balance in the mind. We have balance in orthodoxy. That is, we never say that these things don't count. Right? We never say that fasting, prayers, prostrations, church attendance, sacraments, it doesn't really matter. It's just a ritual. We never say it doesn't matter. We never say it has nothing. It does nothing for you. But on the other hand, it's not the goal. And we have to recognize that the truth and the practice of it lies somewhere in between. And I want to share just one little thing with you. Roxanne might remember this, and I put this in the book. We had the Ancient Faith Women's Retreat last year. I'm so glad we were able to go.
Yes.
And I met Roxanne there. It was so nice.
And I loved your talk.
Thank you. And we loved each other's talks, and it was really great. But Molly Sabarin had a really great talk where she talked about this struggle until she finally got it. And I put her comment in the book because I think it perfectly encapsulates what it is to be Orthodox. So I will explain it. So she's a wife and a mother and a blogger and author and things like this. So she would try to keep the fast, do her prayer rule, all of these things. And when she did everything she was supposed to do, she felt proud, which is not what we're supposed to get out of this, right? But when she didn't do what she knew she was supposed to do, like she violated the fast for whatever reason, or she forgot to say her prayers, then she felt guilty. And she said she oscillated between pride and guilt, pride and guilt, pride and guilt, until she realized that these things are for the purpose of spiritual healing, for orienting us toward God. So the fasting is not unimportant, but it's not the goal. So that if for something happens and we cannot keep it, or we do not say our prayers, we just pick up where we left off. We don't make a big deal about it, and we just move on forward from there.
Exactly.
So all of these things are for spiritual healing, and that's always the emphasis in Orthodoxy, right? It's not about being saved from the wrath of God. How different is that from the West? Okay.
Right.
Jesus paid for our sins, or I acquire the kingdom of heaven. I can see God in the beatific vision because I've died in a state of grace, or I'm avoiding the wrath of God because Jesus took this wrath upon himself. What do we talk about? We say Jesus Christ is the physician of our souls and bodies. How often do we say that? Because for us, the church is a place of spiritual healing. It's not a place where we check off our to-do list for how to punch our ticket to heaven.
Well, what's amazing is that level of ability, Molly had to examine herself with such transparency to even see that one was invoking pride, one was invoking guilt. And that takes humility, that takes studying oneself, that takes examining ourselves. To even have recognized that led to a beautiful transformation. And I think that is the goal for us all in this Orthodox fronema, is that you're constantly studying yourself in relation to the mind of Christ, in relation to the church fathers, in relation to the wisdom.
To the saints.
To the saints. And if we haven't read about that stuff, again, like,
that's right.
How do you know what you're judging yourself off of? How do you know the standard?
Well, if you look at, go ahead, Father.
No, President, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's like you were about to say, you become your own standard, right?
Exactly.
If you don't have it, you make the rules, but a lot of that is the rationalism, and we see that in Orthodox people who think they know everything, because we have a big problem with people on the internet giving answers to things, posing as experts, thinking that they're theologians. And if you try to question them, they react against that. And so you have people who are very opinionated in certain areas, and they've decided what the rules are.
Right.
And then
right.
they decide who's
Well,
on the right side of what.
Exactly. That's the concerning part is reminding everyone as faithful that in many ways, apart from the church, there is no peace. I mean, because Christ is the church, that he, and, this idea that we read a book, or we take a Bible verse, or even sometimes even quoting some of the church fathers really out of context to justify that is not,
That's right.
We run the risk of doing this. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's
go ahead.
right. No, that's exactly right. So what happens is, I'll give you an example of that. So I was on, I try to avoid the internet, especially these discussion sites, but I happened to be going past something once and saw some conversation, but the answer that was being given was totally wrong. And so I thought, well, I'll just sort of interject something here really quick, really polite. And of course, it became this big deal because I disagreed with the host of that thing, who is a know-it-all and has zero education in theology. So after going back and forth, and he would not accept my reasoning, finally, my explanation of why what he said was theologically incorrect, and it was a big mistake. Okay. I said, listen, I don't want to say this, but okay. So I'm a professor of theology. I'm a theologian. I'm an Orthodox theologian. I teach, I've taught for many years, and I know this is right because, and I give him the citations of where, and of course he totally rejected that by saying, the church only had 3 theologians and you're not one of them. And so, I say, no, it was ridiculous response. Now, this idea, and then somebody jumps in to defend him. The true theologian is the one who prays, which of course is a very famous maxim in our church. But that is never to be used as an excuse for ignorance.
Exactly.
The fathers didn't just sit around and pray and then start spouting. And I don't think that they're true theologians if they're spending hours on the internet. That's not a life of prayer. They're pursuing their own ego. That's what most of these sites are all about. It's about
really
people trying to show off how much they know. And then they get into these debates over which father said this and what does this mean? And it's all about the pursuit of the ego. This is the ego on display. And anybody who's participating in this or trying to show that they know better, they are really walking down the wrong path because they're feeding their ego. And this is, of course, without humility, you cannot be saved. I don't care what you think you know, you cannot be saved. So one of the people, on this site I said, listen, you don't have any training at all. And he's not a pastor. He has no pastoral experience, knows nothing. So this one woman jumps up and says, you don't have to have education to be a saint. Well, we're not talking about sainthood here. We're talking about a person who is presenting himself as an expert in orthodoxy, fielding questions from total strangers, giving the wrong answers, which unfortunately often happens, or sometimes they're very extremist answers because you've got a lot of wackos out there on the internet. And then this person jumps up to quote St. John Chrysostom, wait for no other teacher. You have the Spirit of God. Really? Is this what Chrysostom? So I know that quote. It's about the Bible. He's encouraging them to read the Bible. He wasn't encouraging them to spout theology when they virtually know, nothing.
Right,
or they've read a couple of books and then they think they know more than that they know. So this is a big problem in our culture. And Roxanne hit upon it earlier in this hour because of the quick access to information.
In almost every facet of our society, we're seeing that even
people
in the political
think they're
realm.
know-it-alls.
Right.
That's right.
But it's
Everybody's
so
an
sad 'cause
expert.
What's interesting is that they're literally devouring one another about faith, but not in faith. I mean, this is what blows my mind when I'm reading these posts. I'm saying, wow, like if you were to wait a week and go back and read what you wrote as a proclamation of your faith and listen to how you treated your brothers and sisters, there's a
I
level
don't know
of
that they would. I don't know that they would get it, Roxanne, and here's why: because these types of people fancy themselves the modern day Mark of Ephesus. They are going to stand for the church, save the church. The modern day Saint Athanasius, the Athanasius against the world. That's what we say, right? As if he was the whole bulwark against Arianism. And as important as he is, people are. It's a stance of pride. So you can imagine that whoever is, I don't know who these people are, really, but for the most part, and a lot of I hate to say it, I don't want to be judgmental, but don't have much in the way of a spiritual life, or they're not being honest with their spiritual father. And that happens, and I'm sure Father Nick knows it also, that there's something really terrible that a person is doing, but they don't confess that. Maybe they think that this is okay. Maybe that's why they're not confessing it. But at the root of this is pride. And that leads us to our destruction. There's no doubt about it.
We are speaking with Dr. Jeanne Constantino about her brand new book, Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Mind. You can find it right here at Ancient Faith Publishing. Definitely something that I would recommend that you should, not only for yourself, but for family members, a book that you should give, especially during this Christmas season. I just wanted to kind of take some questions that we see already coming through the chat room, Dr. Jeannie. One question says, what role do the Orthodox seminaries play in the frenema, and where might they have influence in doing so?
Well, obviously, some seminaries are very important. We do want to have educated clergy. That's very important. And also educated lay people. The more people who are educated, the better. But they also, just because they have an education, doesn't mean they're going to have the right frenema. Father Nick mentioned that they talk about that in my classes with the Copts. So I teach for a Coptic school of theology, and I'm constantly coming back to frenema because they are also struggling with this, because the Coptic church, for example, was really influenced by the Catholic Church, because in Egypt they were under the English for centuries, and they, of course, they're still under Islam. They're very influenced by Catholicism and by Protestants, and also trying to respond to Islam. So they are also struggling to acquire a frenema. So education is important, but that's not a guarantee. We have to have humility also. We have to recognize, we have to have a prayer life. That's why you see for Orthodoxy, sainthood and being a father is not about, having a certain degree of knowledge. So we talk about the reason and the rational mind. In the Catholic Church, everything is about reason. And there's almost about mental gymnastics, how much you can comprehend and how you can express it in a kind of a rational way. And this may sound simplistic, but there are there's like a papal encyclical by John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, faith and reason. And the whole basis for Catholic theology is the combination of faith and reason. So Catholic seminarians, quite contrary to what Father Nick experienced at Holy Cross, Catholic seminarians must get a bachelor's degree in philosophy. That they do not study theology and the bachelor's level. They have to have a degree in philosophy, because that is the foundation of their theology. For us, the foundation of our theology is the tradition of the church. But that includes the scriptures and everything. That includes what the apostles taught from the Lord. That includes the scriptures. So the seminary is important, but even somebody with a seminary education can begin to be influenced by Western frenema, and this is science. We see this whole argument today about COVID, and so the spoon, multiple spoons. I don't really know what's going on in your parish with that, Father, but this idea that people are afraid of the spoon, they're afraid of communion. We don't. But then on the other extreme, you have these people who are saying, "Hey, you can eat the dirt off the floor and you won't get sick." These ridiculous things. So we have to have balance in Orthodoxy. We should not be afraid of the chalice or the spoon, but at the same time, we should socially distance and wear a mask. We shouldn't be so silly as to think that everything somehow in the church is protected under this little bubble. right?
Right.
So it's a matter of balance as usual. So the seminary performs a function to educate, but nonetheless, if we are not careful as theologians, we can also, because I see it in the writings, there are Orthodox theologians who are giving very rational explanations of things that are contrary to Orthodox teaching, okay? Because they've adopted the frenema of the West. So that's not a guarantee.
Let me just kind of follow up with you, President, with in talking about the science and the humility. We actually had a question come in really right about that from Anastasia.
I think so. How can it be? No, because you can. The pride is the opposite of humility. Rationality is what gives you confidence in your own mind to arrive at theological truths that are contrary to the tradition of the church, and that sort of feeds the ego. Oh, I figured this out all by myself. I can explain thus and such. So rationality, and of course, by the way, I don't want anyone to I should have said this earlier, to misunderstand. We are not irrational as Orthodox Christians. In fact, the prayers of the church call us reason-endowed sheep. We're supposed to the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary and purgatory and all these things, ideas that they arrived at simply by deductive reasoning. A equals B equals C. If, original sin is not good, Jesus can't have original sin, therefore Mary can't have original sin, therefore Mary was conceived without original sin. I mean, basically, that's what we're talking about. That is how they use reason in theology. So we're not irrational. And the fathers were not, they were very educated, but they knew what to use from their education, their pagan education, and they knew what to discard. St. Basil talks about this. Gregory, the theologian, talks about this. So we have to be discerning in our use of knowledge and the tools which God has given us.
Dr. Jeannie, there is just so much wisdom in everything you are sharing, and in this incredible book that I can just tell how many hours you put into it. I mean, it's just a wealth of information for anybody looking to sort of develop this frenema. So I know this question I'm going to ask you is going to be hard to sum up, but in a few words or a few tips, what practical advice could you give people who are seeking to begin developing or putting in the effort to have this sort of Orthodox frenema? What are the major sources of foundation that we should work toward?
The major sources is first of all, there's only one way. First of all, let's recognize that this takes time. So I made this example in the book. When you're born, you know nothing, and you are gradually introduced to the world. First, your parents, siblings, cousins, neighborhood children, schoolyard children, dating, marriage, adulthood. This is a gradual process. During the church, they have to recognize that this does not happen overnight, and they have to have humility about that. And I'm all for converts and also Orthodox like me, born into the church, being enthusiastic about the faith. I think that's wonderful. I never want to discourage that. But don't think you know more than you know. Don't assume that you can teach others. Don't judge others, because that's a common thing we can do. So how do they acquire the frenema, to answer Roxanne's question? Go to church. Pray the prayers of the church. Follow along. Don't just stand there and look around. Pay attention to the readings. Think about the prayers. The prayers of the priest. The priest has incredible prayer services too. There was a time when churches during Lent were packed on Friday nights. And now hardly anybody goes to the Akathist hymn or the Paraklesis. Follow along and pray the prayers. Mind and orientation and a language and communion, if you are prepared, of course, for communion, if it's appropriate for you. But you have to engage deeply in the life of the church. And the more you do that, the quicker you will develop an Orthodox frenema. You should also read the lives of the saints and, of course, the scriptures. But the lives of the saints are such incredible stories about ordinary people who, just like us, were fallible, and they had their own concerns and their personalities, and they achieved this holiness, and we learn a lot from their example. I don't think we can ever minimize that. So these are simple things, but then do it too. So for example, at least once a year, or certainly during Lent, or a couple times a year, Bring koliva to the church. Learn to make the boiled wheat and give the names of the departed to the priest. Bring that to the church. This is not a little thing to pray for the dead. But people don't really appreciate the depth of meaning of the observances of these little customs that we sort of brush off as unimportant. They carry tremendous weight, and they also help to shape us. And I'll tell you something, because I've done this too. We all have, we're busy, right? So we have to stop, and we have to do these things with a certain care and attention, with love, because I was thinking about this. I made koliva once. It's the boiled wheat, for those of you who are listening, that we say prayers for the departed, usually on the anniversary of the death of someone, or a couple times a year in the church, everyone brings some. So you boil this whole wheat, and then you make this little mound and you decorate it. And I was like in a hurry, and I wasn't really thinking about it. I was like, oh my God, a little bit annoyed. Obviously it's for someone I love. But at that time I was reading Chrysostom, and he was talking about the story of Cain and Abel in his homilies on Genesis. And he was discussing why God accepted Abel's offering and not Cain's. And it was because Abel offered his offering with love, and Cain out of a sense of obligation. And that's why Cain's offering was rejected. And boy, this changed me. I said, why am I doing this? It's out of a sense of obligation. I really learned a lesson from that. So this is the lesson for us. We must never do anything out of a sense of obligation. If we are, we need to confess that. We need to pray to God and say, how can I really live the Orthodox life, reveling in all these customs and recognizing that even if I don't understand how this is affecting me, it is. Just like whatever we listen to on the radio, whatever we watch on television affects us in ways that we don't recognize. And doing all these things, we say, well, I go to church, I didn't get anything out of it. Well, if you actually did pay attention, by the way, I think singing in the choir is fantastic, because you really learn the words of the hymns and the psalms and chanting. This kind of thing is really useful, I think, or just at least paying attention in church. And that's not easy to do, by the way. It's not easy not to be distracted. So you talked about how you fight. What is spiritual warfare? Let's start with not looking at everybody else in church, who's come in the door and how they're dressed and who's come up to light a candle. This is the spiritual warfare begins with this. Can I control myself and not look around? I've only known one person like this, and that was my mother. My sister and I would see her in church. I was always watching. I was up in the choir loft, and she stood like a stone in church. We're looking down at her prayer book during the Divine Liturgy. One day we said, Mom, how is it that you can concentrate so well, that you're not distracted in church? She said, it took me years. I'm so glad I asked her this, because she's not with us any longer. It took me years to learn how to do that. She worked at it. And all of us can achieve that if we recognize that it is important and not just brush it off as something unimportant. Yeah, but everybody does it. Everybody looks. No, we don't all do it. I have the same problem. I'm easily distracted. So I have to really fight. And this is one area in which I can improve myself. I'm easily distracted in church. And it's harder when you're in the choir, because you have to look at the director, you have to listen to the note, you have to listen to other people. So, but still, I can enter into I'm really praying. And all of us, I think, know what that is, because we've all done it and we've all not done it.
Right. It has been such a pleasure to have you, Dr. Jeannie, with us today. And I just want to once again share with our listeners about her brand new book, Thinking Orthodox: Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Mind. Definitely something that you should put on your list to get to some, either for yourself or for some family friend or family member during this holiday season. You can find it right here at Ancient Faith Publishing. We also invite all of you to join us for our next show, which will be on Tuesday, December 8th. We hope that you have a blessed day, everyone, and stay strong in your walk of faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Roxanne. Good night.
Thank you, Dr.
Blessed
Jeannie.
Thanksgiving. Happy
You
Thanksgiving
too.
and to the Americans, and blessed Nativity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To you as well.